I think it's important to understand that from the very beginning, President Putin declined to use the term war. He talked about the special military operation, and he was very sensitive to avoiding anything that would disturb domestic peace. In other words, he wanted to maintain the standard of living, ensure that everybody essentially got everything they wanted to eat or purchase or buy. They worked very hard to circumvent sanctions, which has turned out to be an art, and they've done that very successfully. Their economy is humming. Is it doing as well as he would like? Probably not, but by our standards, compared to things here where we're adjusting our GDP for the last quarter down to almost zero, I think they're doing very, very well. Now, there have been some developments. First of all, much to his disappointment, though I think he should never have expected anything different. He thought that he would be able to work with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump would work with him and bring this war in Ukraine to an end. Well, that hasn't happened. And the only way that the war in Ukraine is going to end is if the Russians end it. Now, I think that's coming. It's coming a little late, frankly, and that's the point. I spoke very recently within the last 24 hours to some Russians, and specifically one, with connections in St. Petersburg. And his point to me was very straightforward. He said, Americans don't understand that in Russia, people are discontented, not with Putin personally or with his management of the economy or his overall competence. They don't understand why the war in Ukraine has taken this long. They think that if you're going to go to war, you should go to war. In other words, everything should be mobilized. Everything in the country should be committed to winning the war and ending it on terms that meet Russian needs. But the key point is winning it and ending it. This thing has gone on in the view of many, many Russians too long. That's not just the man in the street. That's people in his inner circle. That's people in the government. So now he's come out and said, well, now we're getting ready to go to war. Well, what's changed? Ukraine is not recovering. In fact, the latest figures I've received from multiple sources, including those in Eastern Europe that have been watching this carefully, is that 265,000 Ukrainians have been killed just within the last 6 months. In other words, January through June. We're talking about 265,000 Ukrainian troops. This would bring the total of losses up to probably 1.7, 1.8 million.
Wow.
We find that incomprehensible, but I'm afraid it's not. And anybody who knows what real war is like knows from historical experience that's not outrageous. What's interesting is that the losses on the Russian side have been so minimal. And we think they may have lost 120, 130,000 killed, but that's starting back in 2022. Well, there's reasons for that, and we've discussed that before. Armies in retreat that are disintegrating, falling apart, they tend to take much heavier losses. Most of the German losses in World War II occurred in the last 9 months of the war when things were falling apart and disintegrated. So that should not surprise us, but it does surprise a lot of people. Now, what does all of this mean? There's something else that's happening. President Putin and his leadership were understandably very focused on Ukraine. And being so focused on Ukraine, I think they took their eye off the ball in the Caucasus. They weren't watching carefully what Mr. Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, was up to. I don't think they really worried about it because Aliyev's father, who was a KGB major general, a member of the Politburo, and was viewed as absolutely loyal to both the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia, suggested there was nothing to worry about in Azerbaijan. Well, that's turned out to be wrong. The Azeris have formed a very close relationship with Israel, and that relationship also includes Greater Turkey, in other words, Mr. Erdogan. But primarily Israel and Erdogan and the United States all share a similar interest right now in Azerbaijan. That is to destabilize and harm Iran in any way possible. Well, what's the worst thing that could happen to Iran? Well, the worst thing that could happen to Iran is for the Iranian country, the nation itself, to break up. And we know for a very long time that Iran has had various pockets of nationalities, though well integrated and part of the Iranian national state and society, they nevertheless still exist. And that includes the Azeri Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There is now a definite, deliberate conscious, use whatever terms you want, plan to invade northern Iran by Azerbaijan in the hopes of raising a rebellion in northwestern Iran, centered around Tabriz, which is the center of the Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There are lots of Azeris in Iran who are currently interested in this. So the threat to Iran is very real. That's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that Azerbaijan was already offering or providing a platform for use by the Mossad, MI6, and CIA against Iran. We're not sure how much was used. In other words, did they launch drones? Probably. But they certainly moved agents from Azerbaijan into Iran, which were then able to set up and cause havoc inside Iran during the 12-day war. So this is part of the problem. And then you have to look further to the west at Syria, understand that Syria is basically part of Greater Turkey. Everything that happens in Syria happens because Mr. Erdogan wants it to or doesn't want it to. Jolani is not an independent agent. He is a figurehead. And Erdogan, for the moment, wants to get along with the Jewish state. However, there are limitations to his cooperation. Jolani is just a figurehead in Syria that we, the Israelis, MI6, in other words, US CIA, and Erdogan installed. So Erdogan was always interested in dislodging Assad, but for reasons that were different from the Israelis. The Israelis are now in southern Iran, and they intend to stay there, or so they say. This is a permanent point of friction with Turkey. The Turks would like to see the Russians leave, but they don't want a confrontation with the Russians. But they would like to control what today we call northern Lebanon, as well as this enclave of Syria that touches the Mediterranean. So the Turks have certain goals in the region. The Israelis have their own greater Israel goals. Azerbaijan wants to create greater Azerbaijan as part of a greater Turkic enclave or confederation, if you will, with the hope of eventually exercising some degree of hegemony over the region. Then you have Iran to the south of Azerbaijan that is preparing for another round in the war. I think they expect the war to restart probably in September. It will take that long for radars, missiles, munitions, and other things to find their way to Israel. So they're preparing for the next round of war. And at the same time, they're looking at this probable invasion from Azerbaijan, which they probably expect to coincide with an Israeli resumption of the war against them. Now, if you're sitting in Moscow and you realize all of these things have happened, it's unraveling to some extent Moscow's southern security area. In other words, Azerbaijan was seen as a component of Russian security strategy, as a friend, as someone that would be a force for stability. Azerbaijan has turned out to be the opposite. So the Russians are going, I think, to accelerate the end of the war in Ukraine. That may mean more devastation and death inside Ukraine, simply because no one will step forward in Europe or Ukraine to negotiate an end. But this incentivizes the Russians to move quickly, and when I say quickly, within weeks, to terminate what's happening in Ukraine. They need now to focus on the Caucasus. They don't want to become embroiled in a war in the Caucasus, but they can't stand by and watch this destabilizing influence that the Israeli, Azerbaijani, and American axis is creating, because they can't allow Iran to simply be broken up. Now, keep in mind, Iran's not going to sit there quietly and allow the northwestern part of its country to be cut off and incorporated into Azerbaijan either. But these are all now connected. Everything that we're discussing is connected. And the Russians have a very powerful ground force, as you know, very powerful missile force. I think their armed forces, if you had to pick a time for them to operate and fight, is probably now better than ever. But when you put all of what I just discussed together, you get the rationale for what President Putin is saying. He's saying, look, we are at war. We are being attacked on multiple sides. We have to prepare for this. We have to be prepared to act decisively to win. They understand what's happening. They understand the threats on all sides, the threats from the Caucasus, the threats from Eastern Europe. This is not new in Russian history. if you go back to the czars, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, I would say certainly up until the 1860s, the Russians were engaged militarily almost as frequently in the Caucasus and southern Russia as they were in Eastern Europe. They had problems on both ends. So this is not new, and I think they're prepared to handle it. But I think the message is being sent to us. You need to understand something, Washington. We know what you're doing. We understand the relationship between you, the Israelis, Erdogan, and Aliyev. In other words, Turkey and Azerbaijan. We understand that you want to destroy the unity, the integral state of Iran, because you also want to destroy the One Belt, One Road. You want to destroy the commercial and economic infrastructure that Russia and China are trying to build in Central Asia. You are trying to isolate us. I mean, that's really his message. And he's saying it's not going to work because we will fight. Now, there's a problem here, and that's us. Are we prepared to really fight a major war? He knows we're not. And all he has to do is look at the economy. And before we're through, we should touch on the financial system and the economy and the impact of the big, beautiful bill, among other things.